You are listening to the 12th broadcast of TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Ed DeVries. In this week's show, Dr. Ed continues last week's conversation with TBR's executive editor Paul Angel. Paul and Ed discuss the March-April issue of TBR magazine. Then Dr. Ed explains that St. Patrick was not a Catholic. He was actually a Baptist. This, as St. Patrick's Day celebrations are being canceled worldwide in response to coronavirus.
And then on page 55, there was a little article there. Apparently the ADL is setting up an online anti-Semitism tracker.
This is all part of the effort to restrict freedom of speech here, generally by conservatives. Although I do see crowds gathering around Bernie Sanders who are cheering his take on an even-handed approach in Palestine. And I always say, whenever they want you to shut up about something, obviously you must be onto some of the truth. It's called our History May Have Missed section, which is a compilation of news items from around the world that you might not see in your daily mainstream news broadcasts, or even in hard-hitting books. They don't talk about it. But they conduct this annual poll in Italy. It's a non-governmental organization that puts it together. And they report that 24% of Italian respondents believe Jews dominate the economy, and 26% believe Jews control U.S. foreign policy, and 20% of respondents agree with the statement that the maligned Italian leader Benito Mussolini, a key ally of Hitler, was a great leader who only made a few mistakes. Well, this is just so upsetting to these world organizations centered in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, and every single European country. I imagine they're in China now too, although Chinese don't put up with too much of that stuff. But basically, people are just getting fatigued. It really worries the people that want these online Semitism trackers. You know, I just saw recently, of course, that ever since Skype, which everybody uses, and we're using right now for this radio interview, as Microsoft has taken it, right? They've quote unquote improved it. Well, they've given back doors to it so you can listen in and see what we're typing and everything else. And if I was to type something like there were no homicidal gas chambers, well, that might go into my file. And then they might just be able to listen in on all these different things. It's just another segue in to get people to shut up about this. We know for a fact that he claimed that there was a rise in anti-Semitic activity after Trump was elected was a bunch of baloney, that thousands of these alleged threats against Jewish community centers and synagogues and such were carried out by one Israeli man, a disturbed Israeli man who ran back to Israel. He got 10 years in prison there. He might have gotten more here because it would have been considered terrorism. But it's also the same part of the same narrative that has us believing that whites are the ones who are committing all the shootings and racial crimes, when we know that, yet again, that this is all pretty much baloney. For instance, I give you an instance in, I think it's Salisbury University, maybe, on the East Coast, has had yet another hate crime in which nasty words and a noose were placed in a bathroom or in a community center, and they had to shut down the university for a day, for a national day of healing. Very recently, it's been going on there for some time, and of course, we found out that it was not two white students who perpetrated this, and the last one, they've refused to release the identity of the person who did it, which tells me it wasn't a white. But they're going to continue on with this, and again, it's all about, I think they've found out, the politicians have found out that we're less, believe it or not, less brainwashed about politics. We are about racial matters and our own past, for the number of whites who show up to cheer when poor old Robert E. Lee's statue gets torn down or moved or defaced, you know. But it's just part of disempowering us as far as a political force, because we are generally speaking more educated. It's not a racial or racist to say so. It's simply a fact. And we read more, and we are more familiar with history than others who are more easily brainwashed. What I mean, look who's voting for Bernie Sanders. It's illegal immigrants and Latinos who have only been here for a few years, don't know American history, and have nothing to lose by voting for Sanders, who might tank the stock market even worse than it is and start talking about giving up free education and free health care, which is probably a great idea, but probably a pie in the sky. It'll never happen because it's almost impossible to do so the way it is. But that's a discussion for another day. The wrap up on this one is that every time you turn around, there's somebody screaming anti-Semitism. And it's come to the point where I think people are just sick and tired of it, and they need not to push so hard, or they're gonna alienate not only whites but blacks and Latinos, to say, well, we've all been discriminated against, and you're not the only group, and they're just making enemies everywhere they turn around. But when you can control the narrative, when you control the means of dissemination of news, when you control the news media, television, Hollywood, filmmaking, music making, history books, publishing, and everything else, the local government, and look who's going after Trump. Then when you control that message, obviously people cannot get the truth. It's why the Barnes Review's outreach has been diminished over the past several years, and we've had a diminution of readers. It's not because people don't want to. It's that we're not bringing in the numbers we used to bring in from our website, because that's being suppressed. We're not able to sell people, because there's periods of time every year in which we can't run a charge card or take PayPal. We still can't take PayPal. We still can't put out an ebook for the Barnes Review, no matter what it's about, because that account was canceled. And it has worked. The Barnes Review has suffered. And for those people who enjoy these radio shows or have enjoyed the magazine, understand that mainstream news outlets are dropping like flies. Newspapers that have been around for 50 or 100 years are dropping. Nobody wants to read. That this job gets harder and harder, and you should really consider making a financial donation. I hate to beg, but it always helps when we have somebody who's willing to understand what we're doing is not only important but dangerous. And looking at the number of people who have been smeared in this movement for just stating facts, that financial contributions are extremely important to the future of the Barnes Review and to organizations like Dixie Heritage and your Dixie Heritage newsletter.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
You know, when I was a kid, Harry Carey was the announcer for the Chicago Cubs, and before that, the Chicago White Sox. A few of our older listeners might remember when he was the announcer for the St. Louis baseball team. But you know, during World War II, you know, Harry Carey had a totally different meaning, and Thomas Goodrich kind of wrote about that in his article, Debate About World War II's Kamikazes.
Yeah, I love Goodrich, a very, very good writer. People have heard me mention him and John Weir multiple times here. They're two of the mainstays of this magazine. Tom has taken it on the chin multiple times for writing true histories of World War II, and he really likes to expose the bad things that the Allies did. But what should we think about the Japanese? We were told in all the movies that were produced after World War II, and even up to today, that they, like the Nazis, were maniacal killers who had no interest in humanity, that they were subhuman, that they would slaughter anybody. Well, we look at the kamikazes here, and Harry Carey, of course, well, that was a ritualized suicide, right? That the Japanese would practice. It's quite an honorable thing to think that you would sit down and take a particular dagger or whatever and disembowel yourself. I mean, honestly, is that fanaticism, or is that just cultural, that you don't want to live with this shame? And many of my Christian readers would think that suicide was a thing that would guarantee your entry into either purgatory or hell. The Japanese didn't think so. So here we have the kamikazes. We were told that the kamikazes were these fanatical, crazy, murderous men who volunteered for this service, and but were then forced. You know, once they thought about it, they were forced into their cockpit, but they did it willingly. And of course, these are the guys who flew their fighter planes, their Zeros.
There was even some mention in some cases their wives would accompany them on the flight.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That was a fascinating point. But it turns out that these guys were a lot of very young ones. They didn't want to do it. You look at the letters they wrote. They felt they had to. to protect their homeland. It was the end of the war for the most part. And they had been also, propagandized to think that we were just apish guerrillas that were going to come in and rape their women and kill their people. And so they wanted to do anything they could to protect their loved ones back home. And this was a last-ditch effort. Believe me, they didn't start off like this, although flying your plane into a battleship can do a lot more damage maybe than planes could do it. Strafing it, torpedo could certainly do it if you can get in there and do it. But it was poignant, this story. Not only some of the photographs in here of the Japanese pilots before they went, the very young men, their comments before they went, how they hated the idea that they were not going to see their loved ones, but they felt like they had to do this. This is certainly at odds with what we've been told in by the court historians, we call them, who are just putting out their war propaganda to make the United States feel good about their war and dropping of the atomic bomb. Of course, it helped public opinion to dehumanize the enemy and support the incineration of mass numbers of civilians in one fell swoop. One drop of a bomb that could wipe out a whole city. You need to read this particular article. And of course, let's not forget that when a U.S. serviceman on a ship saw a kamikaze coming, he too manned his station and was willing to die for his country, for what the cause that he thought he was fighting for. And hundreds, if not thousands, of U.S. servicemen were killed by kamikaze pilots. During the Battle of Midway, we had a picture there, I think, at the Yorktown, billowing smoke out. And we had the USS Missouri. Here's a great picture. I mean, it's frightening. This Zero is no more than 20 feet away from the edge of the ship. A photographer got it, and here these guys are, still loading up their guns to try to shoot it down to save some people. The Bunker Hill was sunk. I think the 4,000 kamikaze pilots died during their suicide attacks, and as many as 10,000 servicemen were killed. So, U.S. servicemen in World War II, we talk about this, and many of our readers served in World War II. They still have great animosity against the Japanese, but not necessarily for the kamikazes, but more for the treatment that Japanese gave their prisoners and the Bataan Death March and such like this. And so I understand this is a sensitive topic. And I think our readers are open-minded enough to understand the purpose of these articles is to understand that human beings pretty much feel the same thing. They love their families, generally speaking. They just want safety for their family to be able to maybe send their kids off to school. But that our enemies are human beings, and there's always a better solution to war. War is such a stupid thing. Families die. Cities are destroyed. Cultural icons are gone. Young men die in droves, unable to reproduce and keep their family lines going. And there's blood everywhere. There's destruction. What's the point? Isn't there a better way? If we could stop listening to the propaganda and understand that really what everybody wants, I think, is peace. Now, there are obviously some religious movements in the past and the present that are looking for land acquisition and to impose their beliefs upon others. But even so, most times, innocent civilians are the ones who are paying the largest price for the decisions of their leaders and the bankers and the industrialists who push for war. So again, I'll say it again, a poignant and fascinating article by Tom Gitterich, who should be commended for putting stuff like this together, because certainly doesn't do much for his career to be talking about the crimes of the Allies and the possibility that the people we kill in these wars are also human beings who have the same wants and desires as we do.
And then one of the articles toward the end of the magazine, I think it was the last one, and I thought it was one of the best articles in the magazine, was about Lewis McFadden. And, I don't exactly know how to describe Congressman McFadden except to say that maybe he was the 1930s incarnation of Ron Paul.
Well, he certainly was a critic of the Federal Reserve. McFadden was well respected, and he was actually born back in 1876, but he had a long career. So he was into the 1900s, and he held one of his positions till 1931, I believe. And he came to believe over the time in Congress that the Federal Reserve System was a corrupt and evil organization. And he had the guts to speak out about it. In 1922, for example, McFadden charged that the American Acceptance Council was exercising undue influence on the Federal Reserve Board and called for congressional investigation. So yes, he does resemble Ron Paul quite a bit. But over and over again, you heard him talk. I had a list of some of his quotes about what he said about the Fed. The Federal Reserve is one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever seen. There's not a man within the sound of my voice who does not know that this nation is run by the international bankers. Well, that would have been considered by people who are hyper-focused on quote-unquote anti-Semitism, that was a term used at the time, international bankers, for Zionist bankers and Jewish bankers who were pulling the strings here. He said, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the people of these United States did not perceive that a world banking system was being set up here. It is a superstate controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. Every effort has been made by the Fed to conceal its powers, but the truth is the Fed has usurped the government. We see this today. Now, listen, Ron Paul and Donald Trump have both talked about the Fed. The job of the Fed is to control these bubbles and let a little air out of the bubbles. We know in a housing market or the real estate market or the tech market gets a little big and too many people start investing, a little air out. But they aren't doing a very good job in the booms and busts. And so they're the ones who profit. I mean, it was the responsibility of Congress to coin money, not the Federal Reserve. Now, we still mint the money, but it's they who loan it and determine what the interest rate is going to be. And then when interest rates are low now, like they are now for loans between banks, well, then they have found out, interestingly, that bankers have discovered that lending us money is loaning us money, I guess is the term, is not as lucrative as speculating in the stock market. So they are also now behind this massive debt problem we have. They charge us interest, right, on the money that they mint. And I don't know how this happened, how a group of independent private bankers ended up having such control over the money supply in our economy. But McFadden was prescient enough to predict this just, 10 or 15 years after the creation of the Fed. Perhaps he was on it right away. And he did pay a price. Many people believe he was poisoned and nearly killed. Now, he made a speech to Congress in May of 1933, and he alleged Jewish control of the U.S. financial system. So he wasn't using his euphemisms anymore. And he asked the question, is it not true that in the United States today, the Gentiles have the slips of paper, while the Jews have the gold and lawful money? Well, this was the end to him. He even quoted something from the protocols about it. And he continued on to the point where he remained in the public eye, but more or less, I think, who was it? Eisenhower said that's the end to him. After he said these things, he's going to, he has ended his political career. He even pointed out the level of control that Jewish nationals had in the Soviet Union. So anyway, unfortunately, he had enemies in high places. And they did, according to the author, it was John Weir, who wrote the first and last article in this issue. These people made several attempts on his life. He says the first attack came when McFadden was shot at as he was leaving a cab in front of a Washington hotel. Somebody wanted to kill him. And his next attempt on his life came when he was perhaps poisoned in his food at a banquet in D.C. They evidently pumped his stomach and saved his life. But there was a third attempt, and this was another banquet in New York City, and he died suddenly at age 60 under very suspicious circumstances from a, quote, dose, quote, of intestinal flu. Although we can see the flu can be deadly, it happened pretty quickly. So I think that's a great story, highly sourced, 24 footnotes in this little, from various sources in this little 4 or 5 page article, which is very timely, as you mentioned, with Ron Paul, in the fact that what the Fed does, what it's always done, what it's probably going to always continue to do until we can get it audited and then eradicated, which is what Ron Paul has been constantly pushing for years.
Of course, Ron Paul, by trade, is a physician. I want to say an obstetrician is his specialty. But McFadden was actually a bank president. He had started as a teenager as a bank teller and worked his way up to being a president of a bank in Pennsylvania before entering into politics and becoming a congressman. So, Ron Paul's looking at the Federal Reserve from the outside and saying, this is evil. McFadden was looking at it from the inside and could say it was evil having actually been inside the thing.
Always nice to hear from an insider.
And so was there anything else in the issue that just really struck you as spectacular and we didn't really talk about it yet? Or?
No, we pretty much hit everything there. I really enjoyed the climate change article. And in our next issue, we'll be probably leading off with Henry Ford, another maligned American. People are really responding to more American content, more how great our nation is a little less of how bad some of the other nations are. People have called this approach refreshing. I think that it's not significantly different. We've always had a similar mix of stories. But, like I say, if you aren't subscribing to the Barnes Review, which is only $56 a year for 6 fat issues in the United States, and then we have that PDF issue, which is a beautiful thing, and it can be printed, can be blown up and read on your computer. And when you subscribe, you get access to our archives as long as you're going to subscribe. I got archives back from 2020 all the way back to, I think he's going to be posting all the way back to 2002. I'm almost giving him more material than he can handle, which is in PDF format, which means you can read 25 years of the Barnes Review as long as you're a current subscriber. And I just encourage people to check out our books at barnesreview.com or barnesreview.org, doesn't matter which one, and consider subscribing or supporting us in some way or another so we can keep this thing going. It's becoming harder and harder every day, as I always say. But we hate to talk about the bad stuff. We want to talk about the good thing. The great thing is we got 4,000 or so subscribers who are dedicated to this magazine. We have this radio program. We have a bookstore. We have a website, which I think with more funds we could populate with dozens and dozens, maybe thousands of stories from back issues. We've got other groups who want to work with us. We support the work of anybody who is working for honesty in history, and again, rejects violence as a solution to our political and historical problems. So that's pretty much it for that. The next issue coming up will be May, June. So if you subscribe, call up 1-877-773-9077, toll free, 9 to 5 Eastern Time, Monday through Thursday, and tell them you want to subscribe to the Barnes Review. It really is a pittance, the information that you're going to get from this magazine. And I've had multiple people talk about the epiphany they've had. Forget Paul Craig Roberts. He's just one of the big ones. The number of readers who call me and say, I wouldn't know what to do without the Barnes Review. I wouldn't have known the truth about this or that or this or that. And they are very appreciative that there's people out there trying to put out an honest history magazine without massive donors behind us and very few advertisers who are willing to take the chance to put their name in a magazine that might be branded anti-Semitic or racist or whatever. And I think that you'll see once you read the magazine, it's really quite even-handed and not really that shocking at all as far as those topics go. Yeah, I just think it's a great addition for anybody's library and something that they could pass on to their younger generation. Nobody needs an education more than the young people today. Generation Z is a generation of zombies. I think that's what the Z stands for. They believe anything the media tells them. They believe that there's injustice everywhere, that things have to be radically changed, that the United States must burn down the house to renovate the bathroom, shall we say. Again, that's barnesreview.com. I suggest somebody go there and subscribe as soon as you can. And if you call and you want to subscribe for 6 issues, we'll throw in a couple issues for free. Just tell the lady that you want a couple free back issues to check out. And when you subscribe, or we'll give you a little booklet. I got a booklet called Satan in Hollywood. That's a great booklet by Hervé Reisen, which talks about anti-Christian propaganda in film, which is a nice little booklet and the $10 value. You can read it and just see how anti-Christian Hollywood has been and has become, but also what to look for and the symbolism that many people don't even recognize in films that is, subconsciously anti-Christian and anti-American.
Right. Well, I do appreciate you being our guest, and it's always I always enjoy chatting about the magazine with you, and we'll look forward to doing it again here when the next issue comes out. But in the meantime, I know at least one of the articles in this magazine, which is the Kamikaze article by Tom Goodrich. I know Tom's told me that he wants to do a radio show specifically on that article, so we'll come back to that at least once before the next issue comes out.
And I'm sure he'll do a much better job than I, being the really dedicated historian he is, who does it for a living. All right, I got to run now.
All right, I will talk at you later then.
Thank you, Ed. Bye-bye.
All right, God bless.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
We're back, and as we said at the introduction to the show today, I wanted to talk for just a few minutes about how St. Patrick was a Baptist. I'm sure that at least a few of you, when you heard that in the intro, or maybe you read that in the show's online description, if you're watching the show via YouTube. By the way, if you're watching via YouTube, please be sure to click like and subscribe so that you can help us out in that way. But maybe you saw that description, St. Patrick is a Baptist. Maybe you saw there in the description of today's show on the TBR Radio website, St. Patrick was a Baptist, not a Catholic. Maybe that made you mad. Let me just say that when you make a declaration like that, sometimes it just makes people mad. In fact, I was at the post office not too long ago, and I was putting up an announcement on the bulletin board that my sermon for Sunday was going to be titled, St. Patrick was a Baptist. And it created quite the stir there just amongst the few people who were rattling around in the lobby of the post office. An old black man, he comes up to me, he says, so St. Patrick was a Baptist. He says, how do you figure that? And so I spent about the next 90 seconds or so kind of giving him a synopsis. And he just kind of looks at me, he says, well, that's probably going to make a lot of people mad. I said, yeah, it probably is. He says, well, I hope you do make a lot of people mad, preacher. That'll probably be a good thing. And so, maybe you got just a little upset there. But you say, why am I even making an issue of something like this? And the reason why is because Patrick was probably one of the greatest heroes of the faith. He might have been the greatest missionary of all time. He was probably one of the greatest preachers that ever lived. But as you look at Patrick's ministry, and as you look at the churches that he established throughout Ireland, as well as the churches of Britain that sent him out as a missionary way back yonder in the 4th century, we see primitive Christianity. We see the faith of our forefathers. You see, these people, these Britons and these Celts, they were the first Aryans. And so they were our ancestors. This is literally the Christianity, if you will, the religion of our race, of our people, of our folk, as they practiced it in primitive form before all of the traditions and all of the pomp and all of the ceremony and all of the junk got added to it. And so, the reason why the Catholics laid claim to Patrick, the reason that they declared him to be a saint, was because they looked back in antiquity and they saw the guy that they wished that all of their priests and all of their missionaries could have been. And they said, wow, we're going to declare him to be a saint. And when they did, of course, everybody just assumed he was Catholic. But he wasn't. In reality, he was a Baptist. And so as we look at these things, it gives us an opportunity to really study the faith of our ancestors and to really see what primitive Christianity, what the faith and religion of our ancestors was like. Remember, as I said just a moment ago, Patrick was preaching in the 300s in the 4th century. Christianity came to Great Britain and to the British Isles. It came there just 17 years after Christ was crucified. And so in 50 AD, Julius Caesar himself takes the Roman army and they cross the English Channel into what we now know to be England or Great Britain from France, or back then they called it Gaul, and he conquers France, or rather he conquers England. Having already conquered France, he conquers England. And when the Roman army arrives, see, some people would think, well, did the Roman army bring Christianity? No, they did not. When the Roman army arrived in England, they found a group of people that they called Britons, hence we call them British today. But these Britons, as they called them, were a group that back then were like Belgic Celts. And these Britons were a Christian nation. It wasn't that the Roman army crossed the English Channel and found a few Christians scattered here and there. It wasn't even that they found a few churches. They literally found a Christian nation just 17 years after the crucifixion, after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so how did Christianity get so far away from Rome all the way to England? How did it get there so quickly? Because the Roman army didn't bring it. It was already there. Well, the speculation on that is that probably converts of the Apostle Paul or one of the other apostles from one of the coastal seafaring towns in a place like Corinth or Philippi or Ephesus, that they probably, traveled as people traded back then. And on one of the trade routes, some preachers, some missionaries probably made it there from the Mediterranean all the way over, to what we now know as Great Britain. And they brought the gospel with them on some kind of a trading expedition. The churches that were established by Patrick in Ireland were Baptist churches, and he was sent to establish these churches by a Baptist church that was established in Great Britain. In fact, these churches that the Romans discovered when they came there around 50 AD, these churches that they discovered were essentially Baptist churches. And so it was a Baptist church that had sent Patrick to Ireland as a missionary. Let me give you the historical documentation for that. If you want to fast forward a little bit to the 1600s. In the 1600s, of course, James I was the King of England. And then after James I, Charles I becomes the King of England. And then after Charles I, or during the reign of Charles I, Oliver Cromwell comes to power. They call that the Protestant Uprising. And so there's a revolution in England, and Oliver Cromwell raises an army, and Cromwell basically wins that war, and he has Charles I beheaded. And now you would think Cromwell would become king, having just won this war. But Cromwell will not accept the throne. Rather, Cromwell declares himself to be Lord Protector of England. And so for the next 7 years, England would have no king but Jesus, as Cromwell governed as Lord Protector. And then, of course, when Cromwell dies, Parliament didn't like the whole idea of England being a democracy. That just did not work for Parliament. And so they bring Charles II, the son of Charles I, who was in exile in France. They bring him back to the island, and they reestablish the monarchy. During this time of history, there is a leader in the Church of England, and his name is James Usher. And James Usher was made the head of all of the Irish churches by King James I. And then when Charles I comes to power, he ends up becoming promoted by Charles I. And then a little later on, of course, Cromwell would further promote James Usher. A lot of people thought that James Usher was going to be killed by Cromwell after Charles I lost his head. Let me say this, the reason why Cromwell raised an army and overthrew the government of his day was not because he thought that Charles I was a bad king politically. Cromwell thought that Charles I was bad for the English churches. And so Cromwell did not overthrow Charles I to save the government. Rather, Cromwell overthrew Charles I to save the churches of England. So everybody just assumed, since James Usher was a big religious leader in the day, that Oliver Cromwell was going to execute him. But that was not the case. That did not happen. Instead, Cromwell continued to promote Usher just as Charles I and just as James I had done, because Cromwell also recognized and respected the great scholarship and the great spiritual leadership of James Usher. James Usher was one of the men who led the committee to translate the King James Bible. So from 1604 to 1611, when the King James Bible was being translated, James Usher was leading that movement. In fact, one of the reasons why I use the King James Bible and I do not use these newer garbage translations is because James Usher was an intellectual giant. The men who translate these so-called modern versions of the Bible, intellectual pygmies in comparison. In fact, James Usher was an intellectual giant of such that he developed what we now know as Usher's chronology. Maybe you've heard of it. If you go to a Christian bookstore today, you can buy a copy of Usher's chronology. They still sell that book over 400 years later. And in the early copies of the King James Bible, they included a copy of Usher's chronology. In fact, if you own a chronological Bible, the verses were probably chronologically arranged according to Usher's chronology. Usher was a great scholar, perhaps one of the greatest scholars of all time, and James I and Charles I and Oliver Cromwell all recognized this. And under the encouragement of James I, when James Usher was made the head of all of the churches of Ireland, James Usher went into this great research of the history of the churches of Britain, but particularly the churches of Ireland. And he did an extensive study of Patrick. And James Usher came to the conclusion, he said this, he said that Patrick was an Anabaptist missionary. He said that Patrick was the one who brought Christianity to the Irish, that he was the one who converted Ireland to Christ. He was the one that established the early churches of Ireland. In fact, during his lifetime, Patrick personally established over 300 churches in Ireland, and in Patrick's lifetime, over 700 churches with 700 individual pastors were established there in Ireland under Patrick's leadership. And so James Usher credits the great revival and the great bringing of Christianity to Ireland directly to Patrick. And he says that Patrick was an Anabaptist. And this is particularly interesting because at this time in history, the British government was actively persecuting Baptists. And so they were even going so far as to execute Baptists for being Baptists. You know, you've got to understand the great book Pilgrim's Progress. John Bunyan, the great Baptist preacher, was imprisoned at this time in the Bedford jail, and Baptists were being persecuted wholesale during the 17th century by the British authorities. And so for the leader of the British churches, James Usher, this great scholar, this great spiritual leader, to tell the British, basically, and tell the king, say, hey, you know, that group that we're actively persecuting over here, these Baptists, Patrick was one of them. I mean, that was just the fact that he could even make that kind of a declaration at that kind of a time was just phenomenal. But anyways, let's go back about 300 years before that, and in a little town called Dumbarton, which is in what we would now know as modern-day Scotland, but it was part of Britain back then. Patrick is born, and his dad is a magistrate there in Dumbarton. He's also a deacon in a Baptist church. His grandfather pastors the Baptist church. And Patrick grows up in the Baptist church, and he says that he knew from a young age, from the preaching of his grandfather, he knew of his need of salvation, but he ignored it. And he knew the commandments of God, he just chose not to live by them. And then one day as a young man, there was a pirate raid. You see, the British were easily conquered by the Romans, but the Irish were not. In fact, the Romans could never conquer what we now know as the Irish. And after a few years, they stopped trying, and they built a big wall to divide Ireland from Britain. And Donald Trump wants to build a wall. That's exactly what the Romans did. But the wall didn't exactly work. And the reason why, the Irish couldn't scale the wall, but they could sail around it. And that's what they would do. And so Patrick lived in a coastal town, and they would sail around the wall, and they would capture people in these pirate raids, and they would take them back to Ireland, and they would sell them as slaves. And that's what happened to Patrick. And so for the next 6 or 7 years, he would be a slave to this chieftain there in Ireland named Muley. And he would keep Muley's hogs, and he would literally have to live in the hog pen. He didn't even get to live in the house or in a barn or in slave quarters. He had to live in the hog pen. It really was horrible. And Patrick, at that time, in what would later come to be known as Patrick's Confessions, some books that he wrote later in life, Patrick described himself as a stone stuck in the mud. But during that time, he remembered the preaching of his grandfather, and the gospel arrested his heart. And Patrick accepted Jesus as a Savior and became a Christian. And shortly then after that, he started to have visions and dreams. And one night he had this dream of a boat. And the boat sailed to England on a pirate raid. And so the next night, Patrick snuck off, and he found that boat. And he had learned the Gaelic language, and he had learned the Irish customs. And so he knew how to conduct himself. And he was able to speak and convince the crew of this pirate ship that he was going to be a pirate. And so they signed him on to be one of their pirates, and they let him on the ship. And he sailed over to England around the wall. And then, of course, when all the pirates got off the boat to go loot and pillage and kidnap people to bring them back to Ireland as slaves, Patrick just sort of slinked off, and he went back to his old home, and he reunited with his family, and he reunited with his church. And the church, of course, accepted his testimony and accepted him as a fellow believer now as he spoke of his conversion. They baptized him. And, of course, he talked a lot about the things that happened in Ireland. Eventually, God would lay it on Patrick's heart to go back to Ireland as a missionary. And so he told his Baptist church there in Britain, he said, you know, Ireland has an interesting governmental structure. He said, their kings are not born kings. He said, they're elected, and they are elected by their fierceness. He said, so Ireland had 4 kings. He said, but there was a 5th king that arose, and he called himself the King of Meath. And he took land from the other 4 kings. And as he did, he kind of became the king of kings, or the head king, or the chief king. And the other 4 kings are now lesser kings under him. And that's the way Ireland is ruled. And these kings become kings not because they're born kings, not by divine right, but just because of their fierceness and their meanness. He said there's a Druid religion in Ireland, and the Druid priests have absolute power. They can just point at somebody and say, hey, kill that person, and boom, they're dead. That's the way it is in Ireland. He said, and the Druid priests are elected for their fierceness and their horribleness as well. He said, that's just the way it works in Ireland. He said, and then under that, he said, you have these tribal chieftains, and then you have the clans and so forth. So you've got the clansmen, the clans leaders, and all that. But Patrick said this. He said, if I can win the king of Meath, he said, the 4 kings underneath him will very quickly convert as well. He said, and then once they convert, he said, the chieftains will become Christians, and the clansmen will become Christians, and we'll win Ireland to Christ. And his church ordained him. They said, okay, if you think that's what God's called you to do, you go do it. They ordained him. He went to a seminary there for a couple of years that was operated by the church in Britain. And then when he was 30 years old, he went back to Ireland. And he gets off the boat preaching. And, of course, the Druid priests hear this man preaching the gospel. Of course, the Druids had this whole religion where they worshipped oak trees and oak groves and all that stuff. In fact, anything under mistletoe was considered to be good by the Druids. And so hence we have the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe today. But anyways, the Druid priests, they heard Patrick preaching, and they said, we're not going to stand for this. So they said, hey, go kill that guy. And so the people who were going to kill Patrick were like frozen in their tracks, and all they could do was stand there and listen to him preach. And so they were converted. And so the priests were like, well, we're going to have to kill this guy ourselves. But then the priests were frozen in their tracks, and the priests were converted under Patrick's preaching. And so Patrick asked the priests, he said, hey, I want to see the king of Meath. And they said, well, we can't get you to the king of Meath right now, but we can get you to one of these tribal chieftains right now. Go preach to him. And so Patrick goes to preach to the chieftain, and the chieftain is converted as well. In fact, Patrick, 50 years later, would be buried in this chieftain's palace there next to the church that he established in the chieftain's palace area there. And it would be the first church that Patrick would plant. But anyways, a little bit of time goes on, and Patrick is seeing some success in England, or rather in Ireland. Finally, he is able to get to Meath. And the king of Meath had a palace that was called Tara. Remember, Gone with the Wind, Tara. Well, that was the name of the king of Meath's palace. And so he was able to get there. There's this huge banquet hall. And it's like 700 and something feet long, and it's 90 feet wide. It's got 14 entrances. This thing is elaborate. And Patrick just jumps up on a table. And jumping up on the table, he begins to preach. And the lawyers and the nobles in the courtroom, they're in the banquet hall, they're feasting, but they stop what they're doing, they're listening to Patrick, and they're converted to Christianity. The king of Meath is converted to Christianity under Patrick's preaching, and they're baptized. And then, sure enough, that whole trickle effect just begins to take place, and the 4 under kings are converted, and then the tribal chieftains are converted, and the clansmen are converted, and Ireland, there's just a wave of revival that sweeps through Ireland, and Ireland becomes a Christian nation. And so the Romans could not conquer the Irish, but the gospel did under the preaching of Patrick. This is, of course, happening in the 4th century, in the 300 ADs. The churches that Patrick is establishing, they're Baptist churches. They baptize by immersion. They celebrate the Lord's Supper or the communion as a memorial ordinance. In other words, there's no transubstantiation. They don't believe that anything magically happens to the Eucharist. In other words, they're not celebrating the Catholic Mass. They're taking the Lord's Supper just as Baptists would. Patrick is starting all of his churches next to deep wells so that they could fill big baptistry, so that they could baptize people by immersion and so forth. And so you say, well, how did the legend come that Patrick was a Catholic? Well, you know what they say. You tell a story, you tell a story, you tell a story, you tell a story. Eventually, people begin to believe the story. And that's kind of what happened with Patrick. They really didn't start writing about Patrick until the 700s and 800s, even though he lived in the 300s. A lot of legend rises up in that time. For example, I wrote a 17-chapter biography of Robert E. Lee. I totally ignore Lee's military career. I write entirely of Lee the Christian. You say, well, why didn't you write about Lee the soldier? Because 1,000 other people had already done that. I wanted to write the book that no one had written yet. But the Robert E. Lee book was easy to write because all the material was there and it was pretty cut and dry. All I had to do was just put it out there. But over the same period of time, I was also trying to write a book about Jesse James. In fact, for the last 17 years, I've been struggling to write a book about Jesse James. And I'm really not making a lot of progress in it. And you say, well, why not? Because there's just too much legend. There are more books written about Jesse James than anybody else in history except for Jesus himself. There's just a lot of books out there about Jesse. The further away you get from Jesse's life, how do you separate between the facts of Jesse James and the dime store novels? The reality and the legend. It gets harder and harder to do. And that's the way it was with Patrick. For example, there was this myth, if you will, that Patrick had chased all the snakes out of Ireland. The truth is that a Latin writer, Selenius, over 100 years before Patrick came to Ireland, had already written that there were no reptiles anywhere in Ireland to be found. So there were no snakes, there were no lizards, there were no geckos. Man, I lived in Florida for years, man. We loved geckos, okay? The geckos all over the place. But hey, they saved us a lot of money on car insurance. But, no Geico car insurance there in Ireland because they don't have any smooth-talking reptiles to save them money. But be that as it may, Patrick didn't rid Ireland of snakes. Ireland never had snakes. Islands in the Caribbean don't have snakes. Hawaii doesn't have snakes. Ireland never had snakes. But these legends, they arose. And another thing that happened is there was a guy named Palladius. And several years after Patrick had died, the Pope had sent this emissary, Palladius. He said, hey, Palladius, go to Ireland, get those churches to become Catholic and start sending us money. And so Palladius went to Ireland, and the Irish churches very quickly rejected him, and Palladius would leave Ireland never to return. But all these years later, as the story's told, it's like they take the story of Palladius, they take the story of Patrick, they mix the two together, they throw in some legend, and anyways, that's what we have today. But Patrick was a Baptist missionary. James Usher, the great historian, the great scholar, established that fact for us. As several of my church members found out on Monday, as I found out this week that they've been going to the internet and looking this stuff up. Hey, it's there. All you have to do is go and look for it. But, a lot of great things in history. And Patrick was a Baptist. And so this week, as we're seeing all the St. Patrick's Day celebrations all over the world having been shut down, man, I never in a million years would have thought that Ireland wouldn't have celebrated St. Patrick's Day, but the government shut it all down because of coronavirus. Imagine Boston without St. Patrick's Day celebrations. Man, it just blows my mind. I can't fathom it. Chicago's where I grew up. We dyed the Chicago River green every year for St. Patrick's Day. One year, asked Mayor Daley. I said, hey, Mayor Daley, if we can dye the Chicago River green on St. Patrick's Day, why can't we dye it blue the rest of the year so it looks clean? And he just told me, he said, man, if you knew how many millions of dollars that we spent dyeing the river green one day a year, you wouldn't be asking this question right now. But anyways, imagining Chicago without a St. Patrick's Day celebration, it's just crazy. But that's what we had this year. But may Patrick's memory always be with us. And so that's our show for this week for TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. I hope and trust that you've enjoyed the broadcast. I want to put out an appeal to you here in the closing minutes of the program. And that is, if you have ever considered giving a gift to TBR Magazine or to TBR Radio, to do it right now. And the reason why is because, as I said, not only has the coronavirus shut down all of the St. Patrick's Day celebrations, the coronavirus has also shut down just about everything. And we've noticed a big dip in book sales. We haven't really seen any subscriptions in the last couple weeks. And it's just really been, this is having an effect. And it's not that TBR is under the threat of going under. We're not going anywhere. We're committed to this thing. But at the same time, we've had to tighten up just a little bit. And so all of the expenses of being on the radio and producing radio shows, the expense of printing, the expense of advertising, the expense of everything that we do doesn't go away. And fortunately, we're in a position, to be able to work from our homes and so forth. But yet, people are tightening up right now. They don't have the money to buy the books. They don't have the money maybe, to get a magazine subscription right now because the coronavirus has caused them to have to stock up on things, or maybe they got temporarily laid off of their job, or, whatever. Increased child care expenses because now their kids aren't in school. And so those of you who are able to help, we do have some shortages right now. And if you've ever thought about giving a gift to TBR, this would be a very helpful time for you to give that gift. And it would help us to continue to serve you and continue to bring the great truth of history to the world. And so if you'll go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, there's contact information there, email, telephone, and so forth. And you can find a way to send a gift to the Barnes Review. Or maybe you just use the address there, the postal box address in Maryland that is there on the website. And maybe you mail a check and just make it out to TBR Radio, or put a little note in the corner there that you're helping support because you heard it here on TBR Radio. And that would go a long way. Well, anyways, I am going to sign off now. But I do want to thank you for tuning in this week. Once again, same time, same place next week. We're going to have another great show. In fact, I'm going to tell you what it's going to be. It's going to be Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy, and we're going to be discussing the decisive battle of Beersheba in 1917 during World War I, and how you can take all of the conflict in the Middle East today and you can source it back to that one battle in World War I. Anyways, that's our show next week. So until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio, God bless. See you next week.